Teachers, when did karmic justice finally come to that one troublesome student? I interned in a class with this kid who always thought he was smarter than everyone else. He was pretty smart, but not by too much. He always got paired with kids not as smart as him, so he would always be really smug when dealing with them. We learned he got that from his parents. During a parent-teacher conference, his parents praised that boy up and down and thought he was the smartest kid in the school. They built him up as that, and they got him thinking that too. Then they went off on my mentor teacher. She wasn't providing him with higher enough education. She was bringing him down. She was terrible. The conference ended when my mentor teacher left the room crying after the verbal lashing. Well, about a week later, there was an event where parents came to watch their children in class. It was to watch them do math games with other students. Well, my mentor teacher paired this smug little bastard with the actual smartest kid in class. The one who was working on more advanced classes after school. The kid got shamed. His parents were so flustered during the event. They were very visibly nervous and upset looking as this kid got destroyed game after game. They left before it was all done and took him out of school for the rest of the day. Edit. Holy crap. Gold. Thank you, kind stranger or strangers. This totally made my day. Unfortunately, I don't remember D's last name, so I'm having trouble finding him online. However, I have contacted another friend from elementary school in the hopes that she might remember his name or know where I can find him. If I can get a hold of him and get his permission, I'll post an update on what he's up to these days. I'd really like to talk to him again. I moved to a new city in first grade. At the time, I was ahead of the curve, reading wise. I learned to read early and was really faking good for my age at that point. Reading was my favorite thing to do. So quiet reading time was my faking jam. Except the kid sitting behind me, we'll call him D, was annoying as fuck and did his best to distract any and everyone around him during silent reading time. I didn't understand why he couldn't just shut the fuck up and let me enjoy my book, and honestly, I started to really hate him. Also, having just moved, he was the first black person I had ever met in my life, and I might have been brought up to be a little bit racist, a flaw I have worked to correct since I realized it. Anyway, eventually, after a few months of close surveillance, I solved the mystery of why D had to be so goddamned annoying during my favorite part of the day. He was bored to tears because he couldn't faking read. And I mean, he literally could not read. He could sound out some easy words, but he was pretty much lost for the most part. And the teachers weren't really doing anything about it, so I taught him. Before school, during recess, on days when couldn't play outside, of course, we were little kids, not college students. During reading time, waiting for the bus, we practiced and practiced. I brought him my phonics flashcards from kindergarten. My mom sent me to school with 2 sets of whatever supplies we needed that day, 1 pack of markers / notebook / pair of scissors for me, 1 for D. I got to know him better and learned about his home life. His mom had 2 jobs and didn't get home until after most kids are in bed. He took care of feeding and bathing his younger brother. His dad was in jail. He had a rough life. Hearing about his made me closely examine my own. This was my first real lesson in racism as well. My teachers always seemed exasperated with him, like it was his fault he couldn't read, and not a reflection of their performance as a teacher. They seemed to leap at the opportunity to give him a demerit or send him on a trip to see the principal even for minor infractions, like not paying attention. Read, looking out the window, because the public school system had failed him so badly he couldn't even begin to keep up with the material. I noticed they treated several other kids this way, all of whom were black. There were troublemakers of all races and backgrounds, but I remember noticing, at an early age, that the rich white ones never seemed to get in half as much trouble as D always did. By the end of the year, D's grades had soared, and not just in English. It turns out, with the right support system and school supplies, anyone can learn anything. He finished the first grade with an A in English, nothing below a C+ in the other subjects. I remember him hugging me tight and saying I've never gotten an A before. But most importantly, he could read. He had joined the world of the literate. He was just so excited. All he needed was a little attention and some help getting school supplies, so that's probably not what you were expecting, Reddit. But my story of misbehaving kid gets karmic justice is just a little bit different than the other ones. Life dealt dear sheet hand and he succeeded anyway. He got what he deserved, a fair chance at an education. Hope you're still out there eating, D wherever you are. Edit #2. Alright, I'm sorry but I have to say this. Most of you guys have been super nice. Some of you haven't. I'm sick to faking death of Reddit's toxic skepticism. It's common everywhere, even when people post in advice/support subs looking for help or wise words, and get nothing but snarky comments saying r/that happened. It's inappropriate and unnecessary, unless you can definitively prove that someone is lying via info from their post history or incorrect details like time/place, saying you went to a concert when that particular artist hasn't been on tour in years for instance. That can be proven false with a little googling. Then I personally choose to subscribe to the honest until proven dishonest Reddit school of thought. Just discuss the points brought up in ops post instead of wasting time and space making the ops scramble to provide proof of an event that probably doesn't matter anyway. I thought about bugging my mom to find some of my old standardized test scores or see if she could find any of the worksheets D and I did together, but then I realized, fact that we are a bunch of random anonymous people on the internet. Who gives a shit? If you don't believe it happened, that's fine with me. I'm not going to waste time trying to prove something impossible to prove. That I was both smart enough and nice enough to help a friend learn to read when I was 7. So unless anyone has a time machine they want to lend me, I'm done replying to comments implying that I made this up. I understand some people imprudently use this forum as an exercise in creative writing, and that's a damn shame. However, I'm not one of these people. The tendency to question the authenticity of any and every post on Reddit is creating a toxic atmosphere which makes honest folks like me reluctant to share their stories. If you're the kind of person who questions the factuality of every post that doesn't end in pure tragedy, then you are just as bad as the people posting creative lies and spinning them as truths. You are half of the problem. If someone does post a lie, guess what? Nobody got hurt, so there's no need to comment on it. It doesn't affect you. It's a story. But if someone posts an honest story and you shit all over it calling it a lie, that hurts them. It affects them. It makes them not want to post again, and it diminishes the overall quality of Reddit just as badly as a bunch of fake stories does. Keep it to yourself. We have mods for a reason. If you have a problem with my story, feel free to report me. But since my story likely breaks no rules, I'm sorry, I guess you'll just have to deal with it being here, which doesn't sound that hard. I'm sorry you honestly think you live in a world where one kid teaching another to read is an impossibility. It sounds like a really sad place to live. What's really funny is that if I had lied and made up a story about how D bothered me all year and I hated his guts so much, and I just found out he's in jail had a karma, there probably wouldn't be even one single person calling it a lie. And that's faked up. Just because it doesn't sate your thirst for schadenfreude doesn't mean it's a lie. PS. Pro tip. If you hate super long comments, don't attack and PM harass another user to the point they feel the need to make a super long edit to faking explain themselves. In high school we had this little sheet kid named Brandon. I only had one class with him, but that class is where the story happened. It was 11th grade geography, and our teacher was one of the nicer teachers I can remember. Brandon would always push her buttons, like I'm sure he did to everyone. He would never take it too far. I think he just loved the attention of getting the whole class to look at him, or laugh at what he was doing. He would make little noises, tell stupid jokes during lecture, pretend to sleep and snore, and any other stupid irritating shit that you could think of. Our teacher, she was quite a patient lady, but you could tell by mid-year that she had enough of his shit as anyone. She couldn't even really punish him because Brandon loved that kind of attention, and it made him all the happier. The few times he got too much, she would give him detention and a couple times sent him to the office, which just made him more giddy. We had a very tame office staff and they would keep him in the office for an hour or something and just let him out. She tried everything, and you could tell she was at the end of her wits. A few weeks after 9/11, some kid thought it would be funny to call in a bomb threat. They cleared the school and went locker by locker. They found nothing, of course, and we went back in. As soon as we sat down in that geography class, an office staff member came into our class and went up to our teacher and whispered something into her ear. I still remember the calm look on her face. In the most professional way, she looked over at Brandon and said, "You're being called to the office." She went on with the rest of the class completely normal. They had found quite a bit of weed in Brandon's locker, and as a result he was expelled over it. Had a kid who was a real douche nozzle when I taught 5th. This kid, let's call him Ray, had one of those moms who refused to hold him accountable for anything. It was always, some other kid did it. Ray was just protecting himself. Ray just wanted to fit in. Ray was being targeted. Also, she was one of those kids who would ask Ray if he were guilty and take his no as incontestable truth. She would say, "My son doesn't lie to me." "Oh really? Your kid doesn't lie? Your kid and Jesus? All kids lie." Anyway, I had a full caseload as a special ed teacher, so I got a paraprofessional. Call him Steve. Ray hated Steve. Had some kind of issue with male authority figures. One day Ray gets in trouble coming back from recess. Steve reprimanded him verbally. By the time Ray makes it to the classroom, he's saying how Steve got in his face and shouted at him. Nope. He asks to go talk to the principal. Yay, Ray's gone for at least 5 minutes. Tells the principal how Steve grabbed his arm. When mom comes and gets him, now he's saying Steve pushed him. Next day we get a phone call. Ray's mom and grandma are coming in and want a meeting with Steve and the principal to discuss how Steve choked Ray. Steve's freaking out. Other kids were there, but no adults, no cameras. How can he prove his innocence? I tell him, go to the meeting, and before anybody says anything, have Ray share what happened. Steve came back smiling. As soon as one story came out, everybody else is disagreeing. Well, Ray told me, but Ray told me. I would have loved to see the mom's face as her kid is proven a liar in front of everyone. Have another one. We had these 2 kids, brother-sister combo, with fabulous names. Let's call them Princess and Major. Actually not bad kids, just a little lazy, but the parents were the laziest facts. Did anything to not work, just sit around and exist. I'm surprised they had the motivation to get off their ass and procreate. Twice. Anyway, there was always some excuse why homework wasn't done. And this was 4th grade, in a city, so homework was sheet like reading a little booklet to your folks, or practicing multiplication facts. The kids also missed school all the time. The kids were honest. Mommy didn't want to wake up and get us ready for the bus. Daddy was up late with his friends, so we report them to truancy. They turn around and find some lawyer to sue the school for their kids' underachievement. If the teachers were doing their jobs, these precious children would be pre-med students by now. Luckily we kept really good records. The lawyer shows up, the principal, superintendent, truancy officer, our lawyer. Their lawyer starts in. Our principal breaks in, holds up his hand, asks the truancy officer, how many days have these children missed? Ends up they'd missed enough days in the last 3 years to equate more than a year of school. Principal says, now ma'am, sir, how are we supposed to deliver a quality education to your children if you don't get them to school? The lawyer quietly packed up her sheet and left. Obligatory. I'm not a teacher, but when I was in 2nd grade there was this kid, Justin. A total dinosaur hammer. He had a rat tail haircut. It was atrocious yet perfectly complemented his obnoxious personality. One day on the playground, Justin fabricates a story that I said sheet a mortal sin for a 2nd grader. I'm not saying I didn't ever say that word, but I certainly didn't then. He tells the teacher. I get put in timeout. For timeout, we had to be constantly touching this wooden pole for 5 minutes, a timeout zone, if you will. It was my first time in timeout, and my emotions were slowly coming to boil from within. The bubbling over of my rage came ever nearer. Justin walks up and starts taunting me. He tells me he made it up. I told him to leave me alone. He kept poking me and running out of the zone. Well, I warned him one last time. He starts running back towards me. The teacher sees this and starts running towards us. It's a race against time to protect Justin. He just didn't know it. Well, he steps within the zone, which was also my striking distance. Let's be honest, probably a foot or so back then, and I deliver the most divine punch of my life. I connect with him right on the nose. His head shot back, like he was in an ejection seat. His legs went airborne. Justin lays motionless. There is some blood. Then from nowhere the most awful, yet terribly delicious, screams start emanating from this little sheet. I look towards my teacher. She's aghast at what she has just witnessed. I didn't get to play at recess the next day either. She called my mom. My mom said, I don't condone violence, but goddamn, has Justin needed an ass kicking for a long time? No. Grounding. The end. I have a ton of stories, but this is the only one that made me laugh, cause I'm a horrible person. I had a 5th grader who looked like a white version of Cleveland Brown Jr. Right down to the hanging cheeks and no neck. This kid was a know-it-all menace. He'd interrupt me, do that weird Ryan a hand twirl, and say, we'll actually manuscript, and then state some random fact that was often wrong or irrelevant. Well, eventually while on lunch duty I see that his lunch every day is a can of soda, a bag of chips, and tons of candy. Like the bag is busting at the seams. I alert the principal, because I'm worried that his grandmother, who was raising him, wasn't feeding him properly. Principal calls the grandma and grandma gets angry. She was letting him pack his own lunch and wasn't checking it. So she's embarrassed that we've called her on it. She tells us that she will only pack healthy food now. She then tells us that the kid's doctor said he needs a serious diet. She tells us that he cannot have any candy. Cut to a week later. The kid is still being a little sheet and pisses off another student. Student runs to principal and says that the kid has been sneaking candy to school every day. The principal goes to talk to him. The kid shoves a chocolate bar into his mouth and the principal takes away the blow pop sucker he has. This kid proceeds to roll around on his belly across the entire hallway, screeching and crying so hard that he's choking on the half-chewed chocolate bar. Chocolate spittle and tears everywhere. A kindergarten student walks by and says, "You look like a baby." The kid stops swallowing long enough to punch the little student. He got suspended for violence, and I got a peaceful classroom. I was a student, but the karma actually came from the teacher. School trip to Poland. At the hotel you could climb over the balcony on the first floor, onto a plexiglass curved roof you find on bike sheds that ran along that floor. Well, this little asshole, who had been in one of the teacher's classes on the trip, alongside me, decided it would be a good idea to run along the plexiglass, then bang on the windows of other rooms. My room was adjacent, so we sheet ourselves receiving a knock from the balcony at like 10 PM, but figure it was a one-off. Anyway, a minute later, we hear what I can only describe as pure rage coming from next door. The teacher was next door to us, and must have had the blinds up, or walked onto the balcony cause he saw this little sheet try to sneak by, and dragged him back inside. Anyway, a few minutes go by and this teacher is still screaming at him in the corridor. You could hear the guy bawling his eyes out. We were like 16 by the way, but even listening to it was horrifying. Imagine the drill sergeant scene from FMJ amplified. It was traumatizing. The guy was banned from any more school trips, which was great, because he was meant to go skiing with school later that year, and lost his deposit. I'm sure the teacher loved every moment of it. TLDR kid tries to harass other people in a hotel, accidentally gets caught by teacher. Drill sergeant scene from FMJ ensues. Edit. Guess what? I actually found the hotel it happened at on Google. And I'm pretty shocked now the guy managed to not slip. I'm an elementary school teacher, so this doesn't seem quite as serious as the others. Here goes though. There was a problem child in my class who thought it was cool to not listen to teacher advice, shrug off reprimands, and make snarky comments. He was hard to manage, but by no means a bad kid. We have a rule at our school that there's no running on the deck outside of our classroom. The official reason for this is that it's dangerous, but the rule is often ignored when no teacher is looking. One day the entire class and myself were standing out on the deck, lined up for lunch, when this particular student was coming back from getting something in the front building. He decided to blatantly ignore the no running on the deck rule that he had been reminded of probably 100 times before, and he began to sprint towards the class. Right as I yelled his name, he tripped and went flying. It was an epic whippet that sent him sprawling across the deck, which the entire class saw. I checked if he was okay and didn't say anything about it at the time, but I was able to remind him later that we do have rules for a reason. I did feel rather like justice had been served in that once delicious moment. However, TLDR snarky kid had epic whippet because he ignored the rule. Justice. Edit. To clarify, the deck is like an uncovered porch made of wood with a barrier around the edge that leads to the front building in this case. I didn't realize that people don't call them decks everywhere. TLDR. Super lazy apathetic kid gets an F in my class, and that's not the worst of his problems. I once taught a grade 11 history class where I had one kid who caused me a lot of grief. He was frequently late, walking in 20 to 30 minutes late. Class was during C slot. He had a spare during B and would actually take the bus home after his A class and simply stay home for an hour or just not show up at all. Additionally, he was super passive aggressive, rarely handed anything in, and obsessed himself with spending time on his super expensive smartwatch and or phone, which is also somewhat more of a big deal as my school is in a low middle income area and more than half the students can't even afford a simple phone. Anyway, I'd pretty much had it with him. A major project comes up halfway through, and he doesn't bother to do any of the group work. I weight projects 50/50 personal input vs group mark, and then didn't show up for the entire week of presentations. I'd had lots of conversations with mom at this point, who luckily had my back, and was totally fed up with him too. Suffice to say, I gave him the only 0 in the class. So of course he hasn't learned, and his grades are below failing mark. Test on the last unit before the exam is coming up, and I'd give the students the option to write a unit test and replace their lowest test grade with it. Obviously every kid takes the chance. He saunters in late, and when I asked if he's going to do the op test, he just said nope, sat down, and played on his phone. I was a bit dumbfounded. Whatever. Edit. Forgot this part. He comes into class a few days later when I'm handing back tests and announces I'm ready for my retest now, Mr. Hardshank. I looked at him and said how could he possibly think that's an option, especially as I'm in the middle of handing out the answers. He says, oh, well, I just thought I could write it anytime. What? How would you get that idea? I says. Oh well, you're too late. How does it feel when you shoot yourself in the foot? Hurts, I guess, eh? Later, I tell him he has until the last day of classes to hand in any missed work. He has lots, some of which he hands in 50% finished at best, but that's it. Too bad. Obviously, he fails his exam and ends up with like a 45% or something. Could have failed him harder, but earlier group projects didn't have a personal input weighting like the last one did. My bad. Here's the justice. He comes to my room, literally begging me to give him a passing grade. Looks like he's ready to cry. How can I fail him? All of the other teachers failed him too. Can't I at least give him a passing grade so he gets 1 credit? I hella noped. Basically said it's time to lay in the bed you made for yourself and told him he can see himself out. Satisfying. Like everyone else in here, not a teacher, but responding anyway. There was a boy in my middle school who was really awful, aggressive, lazy, a poor student and a bully. One day he wrote this insulting and sexuality explicit graffiti in the boys' bathroom. It actually named a girl in his class. At my conservative private school this was a huge deal, and we all knew he'd finally gone too far. He was immediately suspended pending expulsion. Well, his father donated an all-new computer lab to the school and he ended up with a 2-week suspension. He learned nothing from the experience except, possibly, that you can get away with a lot if you're Rick. So he continued being horrible for the rest of middle school and probably beyond. 5 years later an old friend gave me an update. He dropped out of college, not an Ivy, but a great private school his dad must have paid a mint to get him into because he was failing. He then got a girl pregnant. His dad didn't like this girl and completely cut them off. Last I heard he was still with this girl, still not speaking to his family, working as a long-haul trucker, and he seemed pretty happy being a dad. My last update was several years ago. You might feel I'm being unkind by calling this karmic retribution when 2 innocent people are involved, and maybe I am. But if taking away some of his privilege and giving him real challenges helped him become a decent or hardworking person, then I say good job karma. Elementary teacher here. My first year teaching was faking terrible. Really tough school combined with my rookie class management skills made for a free roaming terror class. By mid-year I was at my wit's end, was trying right the ship and struggling. Field trips were the worst thing I'd ever experienced. Enter my principal. He had observed my class a few weeks before and was shocked at easily 10 of my students' behavior. Told me he knew I had a field trip coming up and he would happily stay back and watch any of my students that I didn't want to go because of their behavior. So, a few days before the trip I told my class this. However, I waited until read aloud because that's when it was toughest. The good 12 kids in class loved read aloud. They just wanted to enjoy the book. The other 10 to 14 were constantly good around and not listen to a word. So, I casually mentioned, in the middle of read aloud, that some students would be staying back from our fabulous field trip in a few days with the principal. I told them it was all behavior based. Of course, the good kids heard me, the little sheets didn't. The next 2 days the little sheets continue being little sheets. The morning of the field trip, about 2 hours before the trip I remind the class of the principal's visit. The little sheets become little angels. Field trip comes, and in walks my principal. I calmly read off the list of 13 names staying, while the rest of the class comes with me. I had left the most boring worksheets possible for the kids staying behind, and as we walked out the door all the little shots were crying, while my principal was reading them the riot act. The remainder of my class and I had a lovely trip, enjoyed a great play, they glimpsed what school should be like, and I got the glimpse of what teaching could be. When we got back, it looked like the little sheets had never stopped crying. Best day of the year. This one is more sad than satisfying, and more directed at the parents than the student. I'm an elementary special ed teacher at a school for children with emotional and/or behavioral disorders. Every kid is troublesome by nature, but this one student was truly insane. When we got him, he was a very quiet and polite boy, and the IEP did not mention any kind of behavioral issues. We had no idea why he was being sent to us. Then slowly we started to see what it was. Every once in a while he would just go crazy, laughing maniacally, cursing, insulting other students, getting out of his seat to dance, or run out the room, slap his ass at the teacher, etc. Other times he would just start uncontrollably sobbing. Then other times he would talk to someone named Daniel, despite there being no Daniel in the school. Daniel would make him say and do these things, this student told us. The student is only 9, and the things he was saying were things I didn't hear until high school. It was obvious someone was showing this stuff to this kid, and it was also obvious that a much more serious mental disorder was present. We constantly talked to the parents about it, but they did nothing about it. We wanted the kid to get help, not punished. After a year and a half of no progress, this past July comes around, and summer program starts. The student doesn't show up, and we have no idea why. Turns out the student did something so horrible that he was taken to some kind of mental hospital. We have no idea what, but all we know is he has been committed. I hated having to work with this kid, but I really did feel bad for him. And on his good days he was really a sweet kid. We told the parents, but nope, couldn't be bothered. First grade here. Had a boy that would not stop hitting kids with basketballs. He'd run up and pop the ball right at students. Sometimes he'd toss it real fast and say catch, but most often, he'd just throw it at children on the playground who were completely unaware. This kid seemed like he was trying to knock other children down. He'd laugh his ass off if he saw someone stumble or fall after they were hit by his basketball. After talking with his parents, we told them we'd be taking the balls away from him until after spring break to see if his behavior improved. As promised, he was allowed to play basketball again after break, but we warned he better behave. It didn't take even 5 minutes before he stalked and shot that Spalding special at this poor little girl, knocking her down. She cried and pointed at him, mulch dangling from her hair. He's mean, Miss Misty. I agreed and told her he'd have the basketballs taken away for the rest of the school year. As I got up and walked his way, he started to bolt. He ran out of the playground, past the sandpit, and onto the basketball court. He maintained eye contact with me, and before I could take another step, a stray ball from a 5th grade game hit the edge of the backboard, bounced off, and hit that little sheet square in the face. He went down like a sack of potatoes. Of course I ran over to him, and made sure he was okay. He may be acting like a little sheet, but he's still just a child. I called for the nurse, since he was out cold. He woke up with me above him, and started crying saying he'd never do it again. Please, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I won't do it again. I'll have to wait and see this coming year if karma kicked his ass or not, because he didn't want to pick up another basketball the rest of the school year. I'm always late to these karma train, but fuck it, why not? I've got 100 of these stories as I work in a school for residential treatment facility for kids who've been royally screwed up by their parents. Anyways, the story that comes to mind is this girl who routinely flipped her sheets, starts doing her normal routine of screaming, threatening, and then throwing her desk about 3 feet toward whomever she's passed at, and then proceeds to the nearest bookshelf to begin clearing it off. So here she is throwing these books over her shoulder, and then she grabs a dictionary. Dictionaries are special to her. Mind you, this is a hardback thick dictionary, the kind that has every word ever imaginable in the smallest print that still manages to have the most complete definition of the word that I've ever seen. Anyways, she grabs this and attempts to lob it over her head. The dictionary is hurled heavily, but slips out over her head. It makes a high arc. She looks up at it, only to see it coming down, right into her stunned face. The dictionary misses her eye by an inch and smacks her just to the left of her nose. Blood immediately coming out of her nose, tears follow, class laughing. I wanted to feel bad, but she was the worst kind of a person. Constant bully, highly aggressive, attention seeking, and volatile. For the curious, I believe she went on to a state hospital. Hope she's growing out of it, but I'll be damned if there isn't a new entry in that dictionary under justice. College instructor here. Was teaching young 102 point smartest kid. Was on a sports team as a student manager, and this was his life. He lived to pick up jock straps and clean lockers and all that. Well, anyway, that's fine, and I was happy for him. He sat in the front row and was always talking about stuff that happened with the team, or he was fiddling on his phone and iPad. Sometimes he was doing all those things. He was really scattered. At this point I wasn't really angry with him, just concerned. He was way too cool to actually do work when I gave the class time to work on their papers, and he decided he didn't need the book. I told him many times he needed to buckle down and get going. He didn't. For over half the semester, he would just get up and leave class 15 minutes in if he decided he didn't want to stay. He would make any class discussion hell for everyone else because he couldn't for some reason follow the thread of the conversation and would ask inane questions. He was also pretty sexist and was always talking about various ways he cheated in classes or helped other people cheat. He was so incredibly friendly though. I told him many times he shouldn't discuss these kinds of things in front of a teacher. So finally, I'm telling the class that the last day to drop is tomorrow and blah blah blah. He comes up to me after class and asks if he should drop. I look at his grade, which is an abomination, and tell him, yes, I think the best course of action would be for him to drop. Well, he stopped coming to class, but he never dropped. I gave him an F. He sent me an email with a frowny face with lots of parentheses, like this. I was teaching music. I had a flutist who was fantastic. He practiced 4 hours every day and wanted to be the next James Galway, guy who does the Fluty Shire theme in The Lord of the Rings. Unfortunately, he had an ego the size of Texas. He told the girl next to him, who also wanted to be a professional flutist, that she was abysmal and should just go kill herself. He refused to audition for our local honor band, which was part of his grade, because he refused to lower himself to playing with such talentless musicians. He would bitch about my conducting in class when I wouldn't cue him because I was too busy cueing the low brass who needed help with their entrances, aka teaching. He refused to play a theme from a popular video game at a concert, something that we play to get people to attend, because we need that money to keep the program going. It was apparently not artistic enough. Then he refused to show up to a concert because he was embarrassed to be seen performing with his high school band point. So he failed band and I kicked that toxic little sheet out. But he was talented and he wanted to be a flutist. So he auditioned for Juilliard and made it in. This faker quits before the first semester is over because he believed he was more talented than his teachers. He earned a symphony gig in a very well-known group thanks to a blind audition, where he wasn't permitted to talk and reveal how much of a douchebag he was. That lasted 2 weeks, before he dissed the very famous conductor's conducting, and got his ass fired. His career is dead, because he couldn't keep his ego in check, and I find it immensely satisfying. Not a teacher, but here we go. I went to a fundamentalist Baptist school for middle school and half of high school, and there was a scrawny kid a couple years below me we'll call Sean. Sean was constantly causing trouble, bugging people, stealing stuff, just being a general pain in the ass. In retrospect, he pretty obviously had pretty severe ADHD or something, but all we cared about was that he was really damned annoying. One day some idiot gives him a huge energy drink and he's bouncing off the walls. In this state, and while we are setting up chairs for the school's church service relatively unsupervised, he decides it's a good idea to chuck a basketball at the head of the only kid smaller than him in our age group, Bill. It makes contact, and Sean runs off into a room down the hall. Unfortunately for him, Bill had about 8 years of martial arts training and came from a military family where he learned not to take any shit. So Bill takes the hit, then calmly follows Sean into the room where he's hiding. I didn't see the epic ass beating that happened in there, but we did hear it and saw Sean try to crawl out of the room and get dragged back in like a victim from the hills have eyes. As if that wasn't bad enough, Sean goes to clean himself up in the bathroom later when the few black boys in our school see him crying and start laughing at him. In his infinite wisdom, Sean, trapped in a bathroom with 5 black guys between him and the only door, decides to ask them, "What are you laughing at, nitgus?" As you can imagine, they did not take kindly to this and gave him his second well-deserved as whooping of the day. He was pretty quiet for the rest of the week, probably because it hurt to move his jaw. I have one. This is probably going to get buried. Back when I was in secondary school, we had this Thai exchange student. He's this small scrawny kid that didn't speak too great English, and being from a different country and all pretty much kept to himself. I decided to befriend him, and we got along pretty well as you could when you can't really communicate too well. Enter the douchebag. Douchebag was about 2 years older than us and pretty much a bully. He also loved to pick on said Thai boy because he was different and because douchebag thought he was the sheet. Anyway, douchebag would pick on Thai boy and send him home with scrapes and bruises, etc. Typical bully behavior. One day though, douchebag and his posse confronts me and Thai boy as we were leaving the school, challenges Thai boy to a fight and got his posse to basically beat the crap out of me. Thai boy is being pushed around by douchebag and basically being pounded on. Thai boy is visibly distraught and keeps going, "No fight, no fight." Then douchebag spits in his face. Now we see comic justice in all its beauty. Thai boy's face completely changes. He grabs douchebag by his shoulders, pins him to the chain link fence with his body, and proceeds to knee and kick the living shit out of him. Douchebag can be seen trying to escape, but Thai boy seems to have more strength than his small frame suggests. Douchebag finally collapses, clutching his abdomen and literally pleading for Thai boy to stop. Never bothered Thai boy again. When I asked Thai boy why he would wait so long to fight back, Thai boy says something like, "Back in Thailand, I fight every day. I Muay Thai from 4-year-old. Pain is nothing, but he spit on my face. Face important, spit on face unforgivable." Apparently, he was a junior Muay Thai champion before he moved to my country. Holy shit. TLDR, douchebag picked on the wrong small boy to bully, got his ass kicked after he disrespected the small boy. Park ranger here. We do this urban education initiative with some Alabama money to bus inner city kids out to a wetland. There was this one kid, let's call him Pablo, who was this 3rd grade classroom's funny guy. Live. Animal demonstration. Ask about its nipples and then repeat the word nipple louder so everyone could laugh. while we are walking talk about Animal Pop the whole time. Of course I was professional and answered the questions because I begrudgingly know a lot about scat and nipples. Every learning opportunity for other kids he would barge into and take everybody out of the moment. Every time I got kids excited about nature, he would do some lame peer pressure so the vibe was no, nature sucks. I wanted to push him into some briars pretty bad. Justice came swiftly when I was explaining poison ivy to half the group. He swaggers over and does some kind of these leaves mine prank to disrupt the focus of the group. I wanted to tell him it was poison ivy, but instead told him to put it down, and the other kids were like, drop it. The reverse psychology made him caress the leaves even more, and then before he touched his face I had to tell him what they were. Pablo then cried. His crude but cool guy persona was shattered and everybody listened to me for the rest of the field trip. Once I was in 4th grade and the teacher told me to find something to do because I had finished the math work that she had assigned early. Not like 5 minutes early. She assigned work that she thought would last the class 30 minutes and it lasted me less than a minute. I was extremely far ahead of the course walk and had been since preschool. My dad was an accountant who loved to play with me with numbers. A calculator was a great toy. Anyways, she gets mad at me after I tell her I don't have anything, including a book to read. I had already been to the library yesterday. What happened to that book? I finished it. It was one of the Pendragon books, if I recall correctly. So she half yells, find something. I walk back to my desk and pull out the math book and start working on page after page. Now, in my grade school, the math books had rip out pages and were assigned at the beginning of the year and lasted the whole year, so you only get one and you go along with everyone else and don't work ahead. Those were the rules. I completed the whole math book. Every page. The end of math time rolls around and the teacher goes to collect everyone's assignments. I hand her the book. She quickly flips to get the assignments, obviously miffed that I hadn't ripped them out for her, and she notices I had done every single page. Why did you do this? They're all wrong. You haven't learned this stuff yet. She takes my math book and puts it at her desk. A week later were parent-teacher conferences, and I'm there as she's talking to my mom, relating the story. I'm thinking about how upset my mother is going to be with me when the teacher looks at her and said, Mortally Divine's mom. I have to apologize to Mortally Divine. I thought he would have to get another math book because he filled this one out without knowing any of the material. I started to grade it to see what he didn't know, and it turns out everything is correct. I think we are going to have to find something new for him to do during math time. She then apologized to me. Not the student, but the teacher getting some justice. I had quite a few troublesome students last year. It was a fucking horrible year and it's making me question whether I want to stay in the profession. But one kid in particular was a nightmare. Let's call him L. He was extremely rude and disrespectful to me and caused many disruptions in class, but the best I could do was get him suspended from my class for a couple of days. Near the very end of the year, a girl in my 7th period accidentally left her phone plugged in at the back of the room. She came back at the end of the day and we saw that it was gone. I had seen a couple students in my 8th period, including L, handling a phone in that area. I asked them what they were doing, and one of the boys told me that he was charging his phone. It was the very end of the school year and we were watching a movie, so I allowed it. The phone I saw fit the description of hers, so the whole group of boys were suspects. The next day, I went to the dean, and we called down 2 of the boys who I knew were handling it. They both immediately threw L under the bus, saying he took it from the room and had intended to sell it. In fact, apparently they saw him take the SIM card out of the phone, chew it up, and throw it in the garbage point. So we called him down and of course he goes, what phone? I don't know what you're talking about. The assistant principal and dean both took him into an office to question him more, and a few minutes later, he admitted to taking the phone, but then claimed that he brought it into school that day to show people and someone took it from him. So we called that kid down. Funnily enough, another one of my winners from 8th period. He then said that he only had it for a few seconds and then someone else took it from him. So we called that one down too, and he said he didn't know where it was. So now we have around 5 boys that are all implicated in the theft of this phone, with L being the one to actually remove it from school property. While they stood in the hallway, trembling, the dean and security guard conversed lightly about how much jail time the kids might get, especially Elle, mostly to scare them. They decided that Elle had until the end of 8th period to come up with this phone, or else he's responsible for buying the girl a new phone. Seeing Elle quaking in his boots there felt immensely satisfying. For all the shit he had given me the whole year at the start of 8th period, he waltzed in a minute or so late, as usual, and was about to make an obnoxious wisecrack before I said, "Shut your mouth. I don't want to hear a word from you. I don't even want to look at you. I'm absolutely disgusted. Sit down and be quiet." For once, he closed his mouth and took his seat. By the end of the day, he didn't have the phone, so his parents were informed that they had to cough up a few $100s to replace the missing phone. I felt awful for the girl. She was a sweet kid and she didn't deserve to get caught up in all of this. But seeing Elle have to pay for what he did was very satisfying. I teach middle school. We had one 8th grader who was the oldest meanest kid in the class of 200. Fought a lot and was actually pretty good at it. Tended to beat up a lot of the smaller, weaker kids though. Put a girl up against the wall with his forearm across her throat so that her feet came off the ground. No other kids stepped in because they didn't want to get beat on too. He was suspended regularly. We got a transfer kid. This huge, and I mean huge, 6.25 feet tall, easily 260 pounds. Kid transfers in. He's a tough kid, but quiet about it. Doesn't do much academically, but he's super respectful and is just kind of quiet and keeps to himself for the most part. I saw a lot of bar fights in my slightly less responsible days, and this kid carried himself like that dude that knew he could take someone apart. Nothing to prove, but he will wreck you if you start something. Bully kid gets into some family beef outside of school with big kid's family. Walks up to big kid in the hall and challenges him to a fight by screaming, "You wanna go?" Up at him with his arms spread wide and his face forward. Big kid quietly says yep, drops his binder, and then drops bully kid with the most beautiful jab I've ever seen outside of a boxing match. Bully goes down like a ton of bricks, and big kid calmly picks up his sheet and heads to the office. Bully gets expelled, admin was looking for a reason, and big kid gets a suspension, and is suddenly the most loved person in that building by both students and teachers. The VP was actually giggling as he helped bully kid stagger to the office. Not a teacher, but there was a kid who was a real troublemaker, and probably had some anger management problems. He would pick fights with other students, and try to get a ruse out of the teacher and class, but he wasn't funny at all. He got sent to the principal's office a multitude of times during 1st or 2nd grade. The first time I remember was when we took a class bathroom break and we were all done and stood up to go back to class, except this one kid. He wouldn't stand up. He said, real whinny voice, "No, I'm too tired. I woke up at 8. Well, first of all, no you didn't, because you got to school on time, and school starts at 7:40. He refused to get up and finally my teacher said, "If you don't get up, I'm calling the principal down here." He still wouldn't get up, and sticking to her word, she called the principal down. She tried to get him to stand, but she couldn't either. He told her the same story about being too tired, and finally the principal said, "This is the last chance I'm giving you. Either you can stand up and walk with me to my office, or I can carry you down there like a baby for the whole school to see. Which is it going to be?" He replied with a very easy to predict "I'm too tired." The principal proceeded to pick him up and carry him cradled like a baby down to her office. It was pretty great. Throughout the year he kept going to the principal's office for different things, but finally towards the end of the year he went to the principal's office, and once he was out of earshot my teacher sat us all down and asked, "Okay, do any of you know how many times has actually been to the principal this year?" More than half the hands in our class shot up with an answer. The average number was around 10. Just knowing that our teacher disliked him and was fed up with him more than we were. He moved in 3rd grade, and I was planning a good riddance party until my mom said I couldn't. Edit. The worst part about him was that he never got in trouble with his parents because they just thought he was a little angel and wouldn't believe any of the other kids or even parents. My mom once told his mom off once when he was throwing other kids into a pool against their will. His mom said, "Male behavior just surprises me sometimes." I didn't grow up with boys, so it just surprises me. Haha, boys will be boys, right? Then my mom said sometimes it's not just being a boy, sometimes it's just bad behavior. As a graduate student, I toured the lab sections of a biology class, biology for non-bio majors. For the record, almost every semester, in one of my sections, I get a semi-flirtatious email from a female student doing poorly. They were never subtle. Hey, professor, I'm having some trouble. Can you come by my dorm room at 11 PM on Sat to give me some help? Or something to that effect. My action is always the same. Ignore it and delete the email. I always make myself extremely available to anyone who needs help in my office or my lab, 5 days a week, virtually all day, and into the night. A grad student doesn't sleep. One semester I had this girl who looked ridiculous. She was insanely good looking, and wore virtually nothing. Think spandex shorts, and shirts you could see her nipples through. I'm talking so sheer I could tell you how large her areolas were. She was constantly flirting with other students loudly and giggling her ass off, generally being an unneeded distraction in a class where most of the students struggled with the material, it being out of their major and foreign to them. Anyway, she sends me one of these emails about halfway through the semester, and I do the usual, delete it and pretend I never saw it. During this time, the groups in the labs had been sending some pretty mean emails talking about their classmates between each other using the school email addresses. I was told to pass on a message that it would not be tolerated. So, at the beginning of the lab, before my short lecture, I'll let the class know it has been brought to my attention that there have been inappropriate emails sent in this class, and it will not be tolerated. If I even suspect this is going on further, I have no choice but to bring it to the chairman of the department, and there will be consequences. I immediately notice the girl's face drain of color, and, for once, she is completely silent the rest of class. Took me a moment to realize why she never showed up to another lab. I suspect she had to retake the class another semester. Okay, just a disclaimer, I'm not a teacher, but I have 2 stories here from middle school. Also, one of them has NSFW stuff in it, so I'm spoiler censoring that point. We had this one student, Joe, not his real name. He was generally not a very friendly character, hanging out with all the self-identifying ghetto kids. I say self-identifying because that's exactly how they talked about themselves and the things that they talked about. And being a jerk to just about all the students who actually wanted to learn, myself and a pretty big handful of others, albeit a lot of the students were dropped in there for no particular reason. One day, he actually stole our phys ed, or wellness teacher's phone. The teacher was really worried, contacted whomever he could. Here's where karma bit him back. He actually called one of his friends from the teacher's phone, and told the friend he stole it. I don't remember how he got found out, though it's likely he was ratted on, but he ended up going to juvenile court. Dunno where he is now. Later, in 8th grade, this one girl decided it would be funny to bring a vibrator, one which made noise at that, to school one day. Said girl was disruptive in class, would often mock the teachers, goof off, and was also like Joe, in that she hung out with all those kids. Fun fact, a few of those kids would constantly get into arguments over whether their Air Jordans were fake. Another fun fact, her sister thought newborn babies came out of the but rather than the birth canal, and thought babies were either born either good or evil, and refused to believe otherwise. She would always take the thing out when the teacher's back was turned, and show it to her little cluster of friends and even bother my cluster of friends with it. Anyways, it was in the middle of math class when karma kicked back. The teacher was in the middle of an algebra lesson when suddenly, "Oh yes, harder" rang out from inside her bag. Loudly. And it kept looping. She leaned on the bag and activated it in the middle of class. Suffice to say, she was very quickly escorted to the office. This kid was a very strange 7th grader. In addition to not being able to sit still, which is true of most 7th graders GBH, he lacks self-control in every respect. For example, in his midterm project which he emailed to me, he had written a detailed creative story about how wonderful it was to have sex, from the perspective of a female prostitute. Creative, yes. Disturbing, also yes. The whole thing just made me cringe and made my skin crawl across the floor. On other projects he never did his share of the work and then blamed his grapmates. He turned in maybe 2 homework assignments for the entire year, but it was never his fault. He would bully other kids into giving him their spending money and would run out to the nearby gas station after school to buy candy with his ill-gotten gains. So anyway, I had to put up with this strange, annoying and inappropriate child for the entire school year. I tried to gently correct his behavior without making him feel bad about how he was, in case it was a clinical thing and his misbehavior had a real psychological reason behind it. However, on the very last day of school, this kid stole another kid's iPad from his unlocked locker. Was it perhaps not an intelligent move on the victim's part to leave his $400 iPad in an unlocked space? Absolutely yes. Was it shitty of this kid to steal someone else's belonging? Absolutely yes. Anyway, he pawned it off on another kid on the bus ride home. He sold this iPad for $10. The buyer, also my student, came in during exam week bragging to me about his amazing deal. He had acquired an iPad that was only $10. Of course I was suspicious, so I reported it to the administration, who quickly untangled the entire incident and expelled this bully kid from the school. Point the end. TLDR to the bottom, didn't realize it was so long. Accidentally used his real name. As for the other, I don't know what happened. The story got so long I forgot which name I decided to give him. Sorry about that. Point not a teacher, but back in grade school, I was in 2nd grade, which is like 2006. This one guy in my class, George, is the only one with a cell phone and would always whip it out and brag about it and basically be the class diva of sorts. Teachers spotted him pulling it out during class, and despite having it confiscated at times he'd still continue, to the point where all the teachers eventually gave up. They even told his mom, suing parent-teacher sessions, and even if the mom reprimanded him, he would just ignore her, though I don't know why she didn't just take it from him. Grade school me just wanted a phone like him. Point he also bragged about it a lot amongst the 2nd and 3rd graders, which basically made everyone jealous of him, and teachers told him to stop showing off, but he wouldn't. We were a Christian school and the 10th commandment, don't covet your neighbor's belongings, basically made us all shut up. But oh, the fire of envy grows. Fast forward to near the end of GR2 where we were practicing for a short play of a Bible story, Jonah and the whale, if anybody wants to know, and he was one of the people in Nineveh, which required him to basically stand around. I guess he thought this condones him using his phone, because throughout practice he'd whip it out and just play games all day through practices. Drama teacher told him to stop a few times, but is ignored. She's very fierce and strict, but she didn't do anything due to an earlier incident. Point anyways, nearing the performance date, we had dress rehearsals, meaning we can wear our costumes. The Nineveh people got these long robes / tunics that are like bridal train long. You really have got to watch where you step, or you can trip. This is important. Also, John is a bit overweight, which is also important. Point play goes on. George on phone with everyone else behind him staring at him. Cue scene where Jonah arrives at Nineveh, so the people have to walk on stage and sort of into the backdrop before Jonah gets there. This is where the comic justice starts. George doesn't see drama teacher signaling people to go up, and she doesn't see him either. He notices he's late when he hears Jonah's lines to the Nineveh people. He suddenly bolts out of his chair and speed walks to the stage. He's supposed to use the backstage stairs, which is further behind, but he decides to just enter from front stage, whose steps are quite weary from age. I think at this point it should be fairly obvious where this is going. Point anyways, he starts stomping on the stairs in an attempt to hurry up when his foot steps on the tunic, making him wobble and hop to regain balance. I suppose that hop was a big one, because the board sort of gave way and caused him to fall on the stage. Point did I tell you he had his phone with him all this time? He had it up until he fell, which I presumed made him drop it. Everyone scrambled to help him up, which we did in the end. He had no bruises or sprains, which was apparently the least of his worries, because when he tried to find his phone he was livid. He stormed down the stairs, which surprisingly did not give way, as he frantically went on his knees to search around the stairs, while we all tried to help. But then he started getting rather furious and told us to go away because he thinks we'll steal it. We protested, but he just ignored us as he angrily moved some of the props and boxes around the stairs. When we all heard that sound, crack, turns out the phone fell from his hands and into the dark recesses to the side of the stairs and near the corner where the stage and stairs meet. I suppose by aggressively moving the props he caused enough pressure to, well, crack the phone. Point needless to say, my teachers did not have to deal with any more of his funny business in the classroom. But it all changed when the calculators came. Our kid had phone, always uses it despite it being confiscated and him reprimanded a lot. Stage play, he trips and falls, phone falls to ground, he angrily moves objects, crushes phone, rip phone. Karmic justice served. When I was in high school, our music teacher was this awesome older dude who was close to retiring. He would openly tell everyone that he was in it for the pension, but was an awesome teacher and could teach any class from music to hospitality to welding to woodshop. One thing he refused to do is take bullshit from fac with teenagers. Luckily he took a liking to me. One day he was trying to speak, and when the class wouldn't shut up, I stood up and yelled shut the fuck up as loudly as I could, and he appreciated it lol. He used to do shit like throw chalk at kids, harmless shit that got the point across. But then came in all of the rules, where you weren't at any point allowed to lay a hand on any kid at the school. I watched kids beat the shit out of each other, and teachers watched, because they'd almost certainly lose their jobs if they interfered. One day, there was this little fuck face kid that was always causing shit, stole my bag one day, and always doing shit in spite of this said music teacher, who decided he was going to start a fight in front of the music room. So when he came out and told them to stop a few times and they didn't, he went back into his room, grabbed his large coffee, and dumped it all over the both of them. The fight stopped immediately, but this kid was the kind of kid that would have mom and dad come to school the next day and cause a huge faking fuss about any sort of reprimanding of their child. So the teacher got suspended. But that kid never really faked with that teacher again. Some of my finest moments involve me dropping the mic and owning the hell out of some elementary school child. While teaching first grade, this cool boy used to engage in some mild teasing on this quirky Pokemon girl who sat behind him. She used to get pretty annoyed, but it honestly seemed like the boy was trying to have fun with her. One day, I hear him singing Justine's Got a Boyfriend. You know that tune? I was like, is it you? You certainly seem to be turned around in your seat a lot. He went quiet as his little buddies chuckled at his embarrassment. I was right, though. The next day he politely invited her to play with dinosaurs. That one was more sweet than funny. A better one is from when I was working as an aide special needs kids their 4th grade class. This one boy was a bit of a loudmouth and pronounced everything he did not like / not understand to be gay. Yup, just about everything was gay, according to this one point. Then one day, he switched it up and informed me that something was retarded. I wasn't even going to give him the response he was probably looking for. But before I would have even had time to speak, he said, and I'm allowed to say that I'm in special needs. Great. I replied. What's your excuse for calling everyone gay all the time? Zing. You got served. Oh snap, etc. That's right folks, Ms. Moody ain't nothing to fuck with. Not a teacher. I was the big quiet kid in 6th grade. New school, new people. I had a few new friends that I hung out with, but everyone pretty much left me alone except one kid. He'd interrupt me constantly, throw paper balls at me, and thought it was funny to randomly hit me all the time then run away. One day we were coming back to class from lunch, and I was running a little behind. About 50 feet from class I hear someone run up behind me, and as I turn, they grab the back of my head, put one of their legs in front of mine and pushed. I got my arm in front of part of my face, but I broke my nose and my lip split wide open. I jumped up and started screaming, and all I saw was fear in his eyes. He ran into class claiming someone tripped me in the hallway right as I came in, crazy-eyed screaming that I'm going to kill him. The teacher runs up and stops me, telling me to calm down, and asked what happened. Through the blood and tears I managed to choke out what happened, and, without hesitation, one of my friends one-punched the guy out cold. The teacher was cool and just sent him home for the day, but got the other kid suspended for a month. Dude never came near me again, but was still violent towards others. Last I saw of him was in 8th grade, when he picked on a super nice openly gay kid, which turned into a fight until the gay kid whooped the shit out of him in front of 3 classrooms full of students in a commons area. He was the only one who got suspended again and I lolled. Never saw him again though. I'm not a teacher, but sophomore year of college. This freshman who is skinny and has a thing for wearing a foxtail tied to his belt would walk up and poke his fingers through holes in their pants and stuff. He'd lean on people randomly, like they were buddy, which was pretty hilarious because he was shorter than them. For some reason he also tried his best to be friendly with my then girlfriend, now wife. Well, we had this theater class which was focused on body movement. Our professor paired people up, and lo and behold my wife and this freshman get paired up. Well, the object of the project was to present a minute-long movement, choreographed to tell a story, and backed by music. Everyone except for me did some kind of fights thing, since that's relatively easy to do. Well, this freshman starts talking about how he does aikido and stuff. Every time I watched him and my wife practice, I'd tell him, "Dude, you aren't rolling well enough. Fix your rolls or you'll get hurt." Well, presentation day comes, and this guy is jumping higher and rolling heavier than I've ever seen him. The minute ends, and he just lays on the ground. He broke his collarbone in 3 places also. Never touched my wife again. Throwaway, but the worst student I ever had behavioral wise was a senior named Michael. While not actually a bad student academically, I have never met a more sociopathic person, and him and his group of friends were the only students ever I could genuinely say scared me. These are the type of kids to cause some introverted kid to snap and shoot up the school. Some of the reasons why include: he was unquestionably on steroids, mood swings were common, one of the biggest high schoolers muscle-wise I had ever seen, and a huge bully. Sent a kid to the hospital his junior year in a lunchroom fight after bashing his head into a cafeteria table. He was suspended for several weeks and was almost charged with assault. However, the charges were eventually dropped when video came out. He didn't physically initiate it, though he was verbally the aggressor. Hung out with several other faked up kids who everybody knew dealt drugs. While never caught, there are times he came in unquestionably high off uppers and often would count several $100s out of boredom / to show off. Would also snap when clearly coming down. I didn't mind when he came in high off pod though. He was much more mellow and occasionally funny. Still a dickhead though. At one point the local police department asked teachers for input, as they thought him and his group of friends killed a homeless person, but nothing ever came of it. The fact that it was taken seriously by pretty much everybody is a testament of the type of asshole we are dealing with. He dated one of the popular girls who had her own problems. There is no doubt in my mind he beat her, or at the very least, emotionally manipulated her. He preyed on people. In his junior year, a student kept cheating on the floor while leaving typed out letters mocking the janitors. While there was never any proof, several people claimed they overheard him laughing about it, saying he did it in retaliation to a janitor reprimanding him. Had an argument with a girl in the hall and a coworker and good friend of mine tried to settle the situation down. He near verbatim called her a cunt and told her to shut the fuck up before I slap the shit out of you. She was a teacher in her 50s. Oh boy, there's so much more I could tell you about this asshole. The worst part of it though is his dad was very wealthy and donated close to a $100,000 to the district, and he actually wasn't that bad of a student academically, so he never had real consequences. Somehow after all that, the current principal at the time, a professional I oftentimes agreed with, somehow never thought to punish him permanently. What made it more infuriating was kids who had done 1/5 of what he had were treated worse, or sometimes even expelled. This was a kid with over 20 suspensions, not an exaggeration, throughout middle school to graduation, and somehow he was able to graduate, go to college, and now according to his LinkedIn has a fairly good career. The reason I'm telling you this is so younger people can learn an important truth. The world doesn't always work the way you think it should, nor is life always fair with karma. I'm not saying this to jade people, I'm saying it to prepare you and focus on bettering yourself rather than focusing on negative people and hoping for their failure, because that may or may not happen. For the most part, you can't control what happens to other people, but you can control how your own life will turn out, and that in itself is the best reward. When I was a junior in high school, I met a guy who very quickly became one of my best friends. He transferred from another school, and despite being a year ahead of me, had to take a junior level math course because his old school had different requirements. Nothing new there, really. The trouble wasn't with us though, don't get me wrong, we were teenagers and did our share of goofing around, but the teacher was a very large man and one of my wrestling coaches, so we knew when to shut the fuck up and pay attention. Well, there was a kid that wasn't so savvy about when to shut the fuck up. He was constantly throwing out questions to the teacher about how he could relate algebra and trigonometry into selling weed, and how bullets fly into carcasses and general weird shit, and would also very clearly pretend to be stoned. Our teacher, having more patience than I imagine the goddamn Pope would have, just let it slide off, because he knew he was full of shit. One day the kid starts in on his usual drug selling questions, and is entirely disrupting the class with it. Normally we let it go, because we could generally figure the lessons out on our own, but we were getting into calculus, and were having some troubles, and he was disrupting our legitimate questions with his bullshit. It was almost the end of the semester, so we were having a big test on all of this coming up quickly. The third or fourth time he interrupted with his attention-seeking sheet, my friend saw me make a move towards him out of anger. We all sat within a desk distance of each other, and got up himself, and cold-cocked the asshole right in the back of the head, while screaming, "Shut the fuck up, you attention-seeking fake as fuck." And I gave my friend the biggest high five you ever seen. We were asked to wait in the hall, while the asshole was taken to the nurse. He was actually found to have like an ounce of weed on his dash in the school parking lot that same day, and was expelled. Best part was my teacher/coach wasn't even mad at us. No punishment came to us, and my teacher/coach was just grateful he was gone. 8th grade, one particular student was, I can't even explain it. It was clear that he had some underlying issues, perhaps ADHD, but he was also, very clearly, raised without discipline and consequence, and his mother would scream and throw fits any time he was punished, and accused everyone, staff and students alike, of ganging up on her sweet little angel. Over the years that he had been attending this school, he started to feel invincible, and now we get to 8th grade. There was a relatively new student, a girl, who had only been there since the previous year. This was a very rural school, and new students were actually a rarity. She'd become the subject of his attention, and she had the misfortune of being in every class with him. Constant rude remarks, some leaning towards sexualized, pulling her hair, pinching her, kicking her under tables, and basically just never leaving the poor girl alone. She ended up having to be moved to the far side of the room, and staff would hold him back after the class was over for some random thing, so that she could get to the next class first, and he was forced to come in after the class had begun. It was honestly extremely sad it got to that point, because of his mother's threats and the higher-ups fearing her threats of a lawsuit should he be punished in any way for anything. Well, the time for standardized testing came around that year, and the school always had practice week, where students were given practice tests and had to follow all the rules that came with the real thing, including sitting in the lunchroom to do so. Well, on the final day of practice week, this kid somehow managed to sit beside her, and no one managed to notice. The students used large blinders that blocked out everything but their backs. Well, halfway through there was a crash and screaming, and everyone looks over to see this girl standing over him, tears in her eyes, and he's on the floor holding a busted nose and mouth and bawling. I'm talking squealing pig bawling. When asked what happened, she told them that he had reached over and instead of pinching or pulling her hair like before, he groped her breast. This was obviously the final straw for not only her, but for everyone. He was instructed to get up, and the principal and superintendent were called, as was his mother. Once everyone was present, superintendent being over the phone via speaker, they told his mother that he was flat out expelled, and that he could very well face charges if the girl or her parents pressed them against him. Of course, mother goes into an absolute rage to the point that the police had to be called to escort her off the property. Several students commended the girl and gave her high fives, fist bumps, what have yous, for finally putting the little jerk in his place. One student was actually his neighbor and reported to the rest of the students that apparently the girl had broken his nose, or his mother had convinced a doctor to put a nose brace on him, and most of his face, eyes, and nose area was black and blue along with his swollen, busted lip. I recall this story happening in a science class of mine about 8 years ago. Basically, there was this dick called Jimmy. He was your typical arrogant dick, compulsive liar, and just all round asshole. He'd lie about, I shit you not, spending his weekends fighting Afghani soldiers while hanging from helicopters, which, if true, would have had to have been done in a very small window of time considering we lived in Australia. He would purposely steal stuff from kids, break it, then find it somewhere, and he would purposely just be a dick to everyone. Barely anyone liked him, and those who did were usually special needs students who didn't understand the scope of his actions. Now, this story splits away here into another act of dicey by my two friends Andy and Aaron. They were in science class, both dissecting a sheep brain. They decided to be dicks and put part of their brain into this kid Ryan's pencil case. They thought he would see it and notice right away. He packed his pencil case up and noticed it the next day at school. He was distraught. He told our teacher about it, and the teacher flipped out. Andy and Aaron were sweating. They knew they would have huge penalties for doing it, but they clammed up and didn't say a word. While the teacher was yelling, this one student stood up to try and guilt the culprit. Some people have no respect for others, etc. But the entire time she was talking, she was looking at Jimmy. Suddenly everyone turned on him, realizing he must have been the culprit. Even the teacher started to believe it, but with no proof, just kept giving him extra homework as punishment, which I assume really interferes with his weekend warrior activities. My favorite part of this story though, is that after the teacher absolutely creamed Jimmy, our poor victim Ryan went and talked to my friends Andy and Aaron. He kindly talks to them and just says, "It's alright guys, I know you guys wouldn't do this, you're my friends." This will get buried, but I have one to share. So my 8th grade year, there was this classic class clown, let's call him Zach, because that's his name, and fact Zach wasn't a terrible person, but he had that lucky combination of charisma and humor that allowed him to win teachers to his side. For the most part, he left me alone, but being the weird kid with literally zero social skills, story for another time. But fuck any teacher who ensures a student is isolated from his peers for 2 years, just because you can't keep him busy. This didn't last long. I'm sitting in my favorite teacher's science class, and she sits this guy across from me. He starts kicking the extra chair at the table, and yelling at me to stop. Then he throws his book across the table, and again yells at me to stop. Eventually, the teacher yells at me to stop. I point out the simple physics of the book being on my side, thus with the force applied had to come from his side. She gives me suspension for a day. I was beyond pissed. There was only 3 days left in school before summer, so I only had that long to get revenge. I figured the fastest way was to kick his ass, so I wait for English classroom to empty out, and as we go into the hall, I punch him as hard as I could in the kidney. I wasn't done. He spun around as I tried to sucker punch him in the jaw. I ended up missing and hitting him in the back of the neck. He looks at me with the fake confidence and yells, "You wanna go?" and hurriedly walks away. I wasn't done. I beam him in the back of the head in front of everybody and yell, "Stop, bussy." Yeah. Real original. He throws his binder down and throws the worst punch I've ever seen. It grazed my neck, leaving a faint red mark. The teacher breaks it up and sends us to the office. I explained to the assistant principal that I had to spend a day in suspension for no fault of my own, and I was going to make the crime fit the punishment. I told him I punched the kid 3 times, earning 2 days of suspension. He looked stunned. This wasn't a kid fighting stupid fights. This was simply justice. He asked if the other kid hit back. No, unless you count where his hand grazed my neck here. The assistant principal's eyes lit up, and he said, "Well, that's just enough to get him the same punishment as you, 2 days of out of school suspension. Enjoy your summer." Knowing his parents, he won't apostrophe. He called my parents and explained what I said. My dad took me out to dinner, said not even the school blamed me. Next year I found out that my 2 days of out of school suspension were instead marked as excused absences, and I never had in school suspension. It was bliss. Obligatory, not a teacher, but I'll post it anyway cause it's funny in the instant justice sort of way, but also not funny in the this shouldn't even happen sort of way also. TLDR is at the bottom point. Part 1 is what I've heard from my grandmother. Small prefix. I have Asperger's. Part of how it affects me, more so as a child, is that I have social anxiety and I prefer my own company 95% of the time. Basically I get overwhelmed by people and I prefer everyone else to just leave me be, because if I want to interact with them, I will do so when I think I can handle it. As a small child we did not know this was the cause of my severe shyness, more like meltdowns, but at 4 I was placed in standard pre-K like most kids were at that age. Well, on the first day, parents were invited to be at the school to watch how their children's days would be. Small classes, maybe 8 to 10 kids, and only half the parents showed up. Halfway through the day a little boy started invading my space and wanting to play with the toys I had. I would give them up and find something else. I just wanted him to go away. Well, this happened several times and eventually he seemed irritated that I wasn't talking or really reacting, and he started to just take the toys and push me and pull my hair. Teacher steps in, tells him it's naughty, but the mother pitches a fit that he's just playing and to leave him alone. Well, it goes on and apparently I just sorta snapped, and instead of going into a usual anxiety-ridden meltdown I went into a sort of rage and I hit him in the face with a block. Teacher didn't do anything because it was basically self-defense, and of course the boy's mother throws another fit and my grandmother, smart as that she is, replied, "Oh, she's just playing point now." Let's fast forward almost 20 years and my son has just entered a special pre-K class via his IEP. He also has Asperger's and is completely nonverbal and abhors other children unless they are around a lot. We are talking 8+ months to warm up to the neighbor girl he saw every day when we first moved to our neighborhood. So this pre-K also invites parents to spend the first hour of the first day seated outside the window looking into the class to see how they do things. Awesome. I was very eager to see how he would do. I swear I saw it coming from the first second this little boy approached my son. He was very aggressive with everyone in the class, and I don't want to say he was being a sheethead just to be one, as he is after all in the same class as my son, which requires an IEP, but he was basically being a sheethead. My son is very passive and will remove himself from people, much like I didn't do. So he tries to evade the little boy for a while, but he is persistent. Now, my son is large. Not pudgy large, tall large. He is almost the size of a 5-year-old, and he is 3. This other little boy is just an average size 3 to 4-year-old. When he actually pushes my son just stands there. He doesn't even budge. The kid tries again and makes an angry noise at him, and my son, very calmly, whacks him over the head. Boy proceeds to cry. My son walks off. You bet yours I called my grandmother afterwards and said, "Remember my first day of school?" Just as a note, I do not blame the teachers. We live in a very large city with a small budget. There is one teacher in a class of 15+ students with a variety of developmental delays. Even with typical children, it's impossible to see all of them every single second. Also, my son was not punished, nor was the little boy. TLDR, my son and I are both on the spectrum. As a child I fought back against a child who would not leave me alone and was being an asshole on the first day of school. 20 years later, my son does the exact same thing. I'm no teacher, but I can recall in middle school, 6th through 7th grade, there was this kid. The annoying one, that always the victim in all the teachers' eyes. I'm sure every school has had one of these kids before. I wasn't the most mentally stable person, but he was stable enough to not be in the special education program. But this kid had an obsession over the game Team Fortress 2. He would come into school and do some obnoxious conga sheet or just something related to TF2. He already had a reputation of anger issues, such as punching my gym teacher in the face, slapping teachers, and overall just being a dick. One day, I got fed up with his sheet, so I just went up to him and told him to stop, cause he was annoying the fuck out of everyone. He gave me that sarcastic sorry. And as I turned around, he faking took a pencil, a sharp pencil, and jammed it into my back. He then yelled, "You just got backstabbed." A teacher saw and went to me, told me to go to the nurse. But what pissed me off is that the kid just got off with a row. Don't do that next time. And that go to him and apologize. He just went up to me, smiled and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit you." Later that day, I was changing for gym, and when we went outside, he took a pen, and guess what? Jammed it into my back. Luckily for me, there was a security guy nearby who saw it, and he went off on the kid, just yelling at him and telling him to get up to the principal's office. And the kid never came to my school again. Not a teacher, but a student. When I was in year 11th. I'm a small kid, but did a lot of martial arts training from when I was 7 till then. I didn't like fighting, however, it was more just if I ever had to point. There's this one kid who bullies everyone, picks on every kid he possibly can. He's picking on one kid in particular, the son of a teacher, outside under the balcony above the courtyard. Finally it rolls around to my turn, and he pins me up against a wall. He punched me twice in the face, and I'm starting to get very annoyed, but still not ready to fight yet. I'd taken worse before. Then he spat in my face, and that was it. Vision goes red, and I'm totally out of control. Broke his wrist, 2 ribs, and kicked him in the head while he was down, splitting his forehead open. Only people who saw were 2 of the bully's previous victims. One is a teacher's student, and a lovely kid. Eventually we are called in on it, and we all claim the same thing. He went nuts and jumped off the balcony above, about 5 meters. Teachers believed me. Or at least they all did, except the student who was being bullied. Mother. She says nothing, however, she knows what's been happening. Next day she brings me in an entire cake. From then on, whenever I saw the kid picking on people, I would just casually flick with my hand. In roughly the same point, where he now has a great big dirty scar. He would always stop after that point. I'm not proud of it, but there you go. I've posted this before, but it kind of applies here too. Student, not a teacher, but in 2nd grade, I was playing at recess in a sandbox with a kid that lived around the corner from my house when this other kid walked up with what I can only describe as a gang of 1st graders. There were probably about 10 of them. They split us up, and 3 or 4 went with my friend to the far corner of the sandbox, while the rest dragged me out under a tree more in the center of the playground. Now, it's worth noting that I have a connective tissue disorder called Marfan's syndrome. The short version is that I have a defect in my DNA for coding something that holds my connective tissue together, and as a result I have always been very tall. I'm 6 feet 7 inches now, and extremely skinny, but also very incapable of physical activity. It also means that taking a good hit from contact sports, or, say, a direct punch could cause my aorta to rupture, and I'd quite possibly die of internal bleeding before an ambulance could show up. So they started trying to pin me to the ground, and dragged me out, while I was flailing and screaming, and the next thing I know, one kid is assigned to each of my legs and the others are taking turns literally jumping on my groin, and punching my face, punching my chest, and I'm screaming for help, because I know all that stuff about Marfans, and what must have been the whole recess period full of kids is just circled around me. Watching. The bell rings to end recess and everyone scatters as a few seconds later, some teacher runs over from the other side of the field and helps me to my feet. Turns out, those kids also knew I had a heart problem. When I got called up to the principal the next day, he asked what happened, and that leader kid, who happened to live just next door to my friend, said that his dad had said weak sheets like me deserved to die. And besides, I was annoying. The principal threw his nameplate at the kid hard enough that it actually stuck into the wall where it hit. I did a 180 on my personality that day. Used to say hi to everyone. Probably said no more than 10 words to anyone other than a teacher or my closest friends until high school, and certainly was afraid to go outside for a while with that kid in my neighborhood. I heard he got suspended or expelled, and I certainly never saw him again in my remaining 3.5 years at that school. In college I was in an interpersonal communications class. One of our projects was a group project, and we had to get a B or higher to pass the class. This kid was a little freshman punk from day one. Acted like he ruled the school. This isn't HS buddy, nobody cares, and generally liked to be a jerk in class. Of course I was grouped up with him and 3 others. Everyone else was great about contributing, except him. He always had an excuse. We were getting increasingly pissed that this guy was going to coast on our grade because we all intended on getting A's for the assignment. I ended up sliding into the role of leader because I can't stand that horrible period of time where a group just stares at one another waiting for something to happen. We talked it out and agreed we didn't want him getting our grade. He hadn't earned it, so I went to talk to the teacher. She gave me permission to kick him out of the group, even let me use the classroom after class. I think she just wanted to watch me dash his dreams of coasting tbh. We sat down and I started explaining that it's a group grade and the grade represents the work of the group, and despite all our efforts to involve him, he hadn't been participating. I told him he was out of the group and he wouldn't be presenting and receiving the same grade as us. He sat there spluttering before throwing out the final excuse that his stepmom had just hung herself, and that was why he hadn't been participating. He couldn't fail this class because his parents would be upset. I told him that if that's the case he could go talk to people in the administrative office and they might be able to work with him. That there might be other options, but that him presenting with our group wasn't going to be one of them. Icing on the cake was the teacher's grin after he left the classroom. I aced that class, and damn if it, I didn't deserve an A in an interpersonal communication course after that point, and a huge shout out to that prof for letting us teach him. I teach high school. I locked horns with a student a few years back. She was smug about everything, came from a prominent local family, was a generally shitty person, but was completely untouchable. Her parents were always riding my ass about things that would happen in class. The student went on a field trip to a local museum and got kicked off the tour for being her normal as whole self. After a few phone calls, the museum actually apologized to her. As much as it sucked having to deal with the student and her parents, I understood it was a one-year thing and then I'd never have to deal with her again. So I just tried to push through. At the end of the year, the school gave away a used car that had been donated by an anonymous member of the community. The drawing was open to students with a certain GPA. The student didn't qualify because of the grade she'd received from me. Her and her parents lost their shit over it and wanted me to change the grade. The principal heavily suggests that I should go along with it, mostly because she was really close grade-wise, and since she most likely wouldn't win the car anyway. I rounded the grade up, just to keep everyone from cheating on me. The beach totally won the faking car. I was faking pissed. 2 weeks later, the car caught on fire as she smoked while pumping gas. She escaped without injury, but the car was a total loss. After school care story, but we had to teach lessons like extra classwork. Quick disclaimer, don't judge please. This kid and his siblings were neglected when young, but were living with great relatives 3+ years when this happened, and he was only about 7 or so. So while this kid should be prayed for and pitied and needs patience, I was done with feeling those things for the day. He acted awful for several years and he totally knew better. Let's call this kid Tommy. At the after school care, he was a little monster. I'm talking beating up on other kids, stepping up to other kids' faces, and screaming or yelling very gruffly things, like "I don't like you," or "shut up." Definitely accented words there, in his gruff voice. Not the worst kid, but worst at the sight. This kid could not play a single game with someone without yelling "you're cheating," or "no fair," yet would grin at you, and give you a cheeky look, when he changed the rules on you. Well, Tommy wasn't listening to the rules on a day when some sort of carnival visited the school, and during the extended carnival recess fell off of some playground equipment and broke his elbow, meaning he couldn't play the kickball or bull tag games on the playground that he kept throwing fits about and getting banned each week due to arguments. Bad program management equals no manager or staff leader would keep certain kids from playing certain games. Every kid would lose out based on the actions of one or two. Our list of banned games was roughly a mile long, included all of the fun games. This kid went on to be awful at the summer program and has since made some progress, but I still intensely dislike this kid. I'd still run in front of a car if he got into the street, though. Kids. I had a student in my first year teaching that had a 20% in a high school English class. She only had that high of a grade because I felt sorry for her and stopped putting in zeros in the gradebook, leaving the spots blank instead. She was always late and obnoxious, So the low grade wasn't surprising. We had just finished an activity and it was around the end of the year, so we had state testing. In VA they're called sols. She said she was finished with her activity for Romeo and Juliet and asked if she could get on my computer to study for her geography final. I said okay. What I didn't realize is that she accessed my gradebook. Her 20% magically became an 80%. When I found out, I was furious. Absolutely pissed. Well, for my class we had folders that the students kept their work in. I went back through her folder and put in anything that she had. She had just thrown away a bunch of stuff from the last unit, so anything missing, whether it was a warm-up or a test, went in as a 0. Her grade ended up becoming a 12%. Next class, I was greeting people in the hallway before they came in and pulled her aside. I handed her a grade report and said that something had happened with the gradebook after she got on my computer last class and her grade was changed, but not to worry because I changed it back to what it was supposed to be. She immediately got on the defensive and said she didn't do it, yada yada, lip service. I said it didn't matter if gnomes did it. This is your current grade based on the assignments I have in class, and that I hoped she'd try harder at 9th grade next year. TLDR, try to cheat your grade and you'll receive a lower E than you had to start. I'm not true teacher, but I was a sub for a small college off and on a while back. It was a networking and security class, and I had a student who would totally get every answer from Google. Every single word on anything we gave him. An essay, homework, class walk, everything. Every single word was copied. Was easy to find. He would tell everyone that he worked for Microsoft and got bored working for Google and Cisco. He would tell us he worked at the Googleplex in Santa Ana County, Mountain View. I asked him a ton of questions and he always had an answer that would be convincing to any non-technical people. I would mark his grade minus 20% and he complained to the school. I brought my proof and they gave him a warning. A month later I was called in by the main teacher because he organized the class to go visit a Google building in Mountain View. I remember him telling us stories about his work there in the cloud security room, in which he says there are hundreds of servers he had to maintain. When we arrived he seemed excited and was like, "Oh my god, this is awesome." I ended up speaking to the man who had this 30-minute tour happen and asked me what we teach. I told him one of our students used to work here. He met with the student and asked him what he used to do and what department. The kid froze and said exactly what he told me. The guy said, we don't have any department like that here, but we have data centers everywhere. The guy immediately admitted he didn't work for Google and stomped off. He quit school when we got back. By the way, Google doesn't do tours necessarily unless you know someone. The teacher of the class is subbed for Meta Guy at a security conference in San Diego. Went to school with a real little sheet called, believe it or not, Michael Jackson. They were a weird family. Michael seemed to go out of his way to make trouble. His older brother was in my class and was an immature sheet who looked exactly like Uncle Fester with hair and intentionally talked like a baby. Once he plugged a cable with exposed wires on the end into a power outlet, joined the wires together, and shorted out the whole school for 3 days. By comparison, the older sister seemed to be fairly normal. Mr. Brown was a teacher from the old school. He looked like he should he been in charge of a 1920s fishing trawler and would smoke a pipe in class. It was 1992. None of the kids dared make any noise in his class as he would look up from his 4WD magazine and bellow at them to shut up. That being said, if you weren't a little sheet, he was okay to get along with. One day, Mr. Brown left the kids, 10 to 11 years old, whilst they were painting, and came back to find Mr. Brown sucks painted in blue paint on the carpet. When he asked, presumably using many decibels, who was responsible, the whole class said nothing but a lot of heads swiveled to look at MJ, who was clearly the only one stupid enough to do it. Mr. Brown punched him. He lost some teeth. I'm not in his class, but I know this because I was filled in later, and I also saw his older sister washing blood out of his mouth in a washroom immediately afterwards. As for Mr. Brown, he still taught there for some years afterwards, which is probably a good indication of how much this little sheet deserved what he got. I taught high school science/math for 4 years in a rougher part of Melbourne's Australia, western suburbs. Most of our kids were pretty amazing for their circumstances, but we always had a handful of students that were batshit crazy. One girl in particular, around 15 to 16-year-old, was a massive pain in my ass. Would take any chance to disrupt the class, shout very obscene things, get into fights with other students, plus much more. She generally thought she ran the school, for some reason, and I wasn't the only teacher who had a massive problem with her. Unfortunately, there wasn't too much we could do aside from sending her through the detention system. You can't just kick a student out of school for being an asshole. Very unfortunate. Anyways, one day she was around the VP office, and she noticed in the back corner of the office a stack of cash that the VP kind of stupidly left out. So the student didn't hesitate to grab the cash and run outside. Here's where her stupidity got the best of her. Not 10 minutes after stealing around $1,000 in cash, she Facebook just stole $1,000 off VP's name, desk. What a moron. It took about 5 minutes for another student to see this and showed it to another teacher. Cops were called, and well, the rest is pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes you just have to let the Darwin Awards take care of themselves. Justice. Alright, so I'm a camp counselor, right? Well, I was working with one of our kids who have behavioral problems, and this kid is intelligent. He may have a hothead and doesn't understand things sometimes, but boy, he is one of the smartest kids I've ever come across and extremely manipulative. Well, he's been a sheet all week, and we're in the pool having a great time. The signal comes to take all of the kids out, so we can change and go to sign out. This is walks a quarter out of the pool, and I carry him the other quarter, and he swims up to get out, and I'm like, great. His attitude at changing. Nope. I spoke too soon. He swims all the way back in. He's not listening to me, another counselor, or our leaders. He's just going underwater every time we talk to him. It's to the point where we are about to get a lifeguard in the pool to drag him out. After about 5 excruciating minutes, he finally gets his happy ass out of the pool. The leader comes up to me and asks, do you want to just talk to his dad, or do you want to give him one of our punishment worksheets? I say, fuck yeah, I'm giving him a worksheet, which no one ever does, so he's never accountable for his actions. Now he has no idea. We get him into a room so we can talk, and he freaks the fuck out. Like tearing papers and slamming his fists on the table. It takes us over 20 minutes. He's hitting me, and I'm writing the sheet for him. I will never forget the look on his face when his dad says, well, I guess you won't be swimming the next swim day. It taught him, and he always got out after that. I taught martial arts at the dojo I trained at many years ago. There was a fat ginger girl who was about a foot and 50 pounds over all the other kids in the 10 to 14-year-old class. Plus someone at some point told her she's a girl and can get away with fighting dirty, despite us training martial arts anyway. There was a quiet little kid in the class who could be a brutal little fack when he hit his stride while sparring, but usually blocked and parried instead of actually attacking. Somehow he got paired with Ginger Beach one day for sparring, and she was being her usual antagonizing beach self. FWIW, she could actually fight pretty well when she wasn't being a beach, but couldn't stand little guy not attacking. So she did what any rational teen girl would do and clawed his face. Badly enough that it bled, which I didn't catch right away because she let her guard down when he backed up holding his face, but then he proceeded to punch her in the sweater puppets as hard as his little self could muster. I'm not sure why a 10-year-old boy knew that was the fuck you spot to hit a girl, but he laid into her with everything he had and walked off cool as a motherfucker to get his eye cleaned up. Drop the Ginger Beach like a bad habit. I was the only instructor who saw what really happened, and best believe I didn't rat on him. Beach tried to kick me in the balls when I was sparring with her one day, and I had to refrain from doing the same thing. She was 13 to 14, I was 15, and in the next bracket up, so they outsourced us older kids to teach the youngins. I told the teacher that she clawed his face as he was attacking, and it was probably an accident that he landed a solid two-handed Superman punch to her chest. I had a student who thought he was smart, but was actually really stupid. He wasn't even just mentally slow, he had social difficulties as well, because he never stopped telling people about things his mother said. His mother was the kind of person who would stop at nothing to make her child a winner. Even when he didn't know how to spell basic words, he was so obnoxious about it too. If I told him an answer could use more elaboration or detail, he would say mummy says. Yes, he actually used the term mummy, that long answers aren't always the best answers. He would have a legitimate tantrum if he got 1% lower than the student sitting next to him, and would always threaten me with "You will be hearing from my mum about this." After many ridiculous emails from his mother telling me I'm holding back her special gifted son because I'm marking him down because he's different, I decided I had enough. The next assessment was a written report. The kid finished his before everyone else and obnoxiously slapped it on my desk saying, "I think you will really learn a lot from this one." So I make the paper fairly as I would with any student, but the entire thing was a bunch of incoherent babble and random quotes that had nothing to do with anything. What's more, he only wrote one paragraph, about 200 words, and the entire assignment had to be 1000 words. I have him a very generous 45%, just under a pass in Australia. The next day I was ready. I knew he would be furious that I had failed him. He stormed over to my desk and shoved the graded paper in my face, visibly shaking with anger. "How dare you?" he yelled. I remained composed and told him that if he was really unhappy with his grade/mark, I could ask 2 or 3 other teachers to grade it and see what they think. He seemed to think that was okay and was sure the others would give him an A. Of course, I got an email from mummy stating her outrage for the whole situation. When the other teachers graded his paper, they emailed me the scores. They gave him 7% and 22%. They both agreed I was too generous and the paper was faking illiterate. The look on his face when he saw the scores was priceless. He was convinced that he would get an A grade. Sent the scores to mummy. She pulled her son out of the school the following week claiming that we were all idiots and couldn't see true talent in a student. But I got my revenge and all the other students were so relieved when he left. I'm not a teacher and this wasn't at school, but I think it's relevant. I had a friend, call him Jeff, who was a really spoiled kid who was adopted by a very rich white family. This kid got everything and was your typical self-entitled brat, but for some reason thought he was a gangster. He would wear completely red outfits and would throw up the blood sign all the time. Keep in mind this was back in middle school and we lived in one of the more affluent neighborhoods in town. Well, my friend, call him Pablo, was hanging out with Jeff and they were walking down home. Jeff of course is walking in the middle of the street with his pants down to his knees blasting music from a speaker on his shoulder. A car pulls up behind him and honks a few times. Jeff, being a gangster, just laughed and flipped off the driver behind him. The next thing is one of the few things that makes me believe that karma must be real, because the driver got out of the car and lo and behold was 6-foot tall black man with arms the size of basketballs and tattoos that made Mike Tyson look sane. Basically Debo from Friday. Debo then storms over and yelling about how if he weren't on probation he would be the shit out Jeff right then and there. The next few minutes were nothing but verbal abuse that would put the drill sergeant from Full Metal Jacket to shame and complete and utter silence from Jeff. Karma is faking delicious. Mine is actually the opposite. I was the student and the teacher was the douche. It was high school gym. This dude was an absolute tool to anyone who wasn't an athlete. He let football players do things he would write up other people for. I wasn't on a team, but I played some sports for fun and was in pretty decent shape, 6 feet 2 inches and 220 lbs. But still, he would treat me the worst at some points. I assume because he thought I was built for sports and was too lazy to play on the school teams or something. Anyway, one day we were playing baseball inside with a real ball. No idea why he thought that was a good idea. He would give the football players perfect pitches. They would of course hit it and run the bases. He gave the non-athletes shitty pitches that would hit the ground before they reached the batter. The batter would of course swing, not knowing any better, and he would strike them out. My turn to bat came. As expected, first pitch rolls across home base, and I don't swing. He called a strike. I protested because it was a bad pitch and I didn't swing at it. His only response was no, it's a strike. Second pitch also rolls by. Still not swinging, but I have 2 strikes. By that time I had had enough, and I decided to use a little trick my dad had taught me. Missed the Rashad pitches again, and as expected, it will not reach the plate. So I take one big step forward and do a golf swing, hitting it right before it hits the ground. This sent the ball directly at his stupid face, and he barely avoided losing some teeth. I ran the bases, made it home, and that dick never hassled me again. Still get pissed when I remember that jerk. Well, I wasn't a teacher. I've had plenty of bullies in school. Anyway, this one particular kid, he went to my school from like 1st to 3rd grade of my school. He then moved away, thank God. How do I even say this? He was just kind of obnoxious, mean, would argue with teachers/students, yell at me, tattletale on me. He was also friends with one of my friends, so that wasn't really a good thing for me. One time he laughed in my face with this weird horse sound, and I inhaled his breath and had a weird cold with the smell of his breath in my throat for a long time. He was from a hardcore Christian family. His family was no better than he was. I was at a birthday party once for my friend who was friends with him. His little sister was lecturing me about how my plate was supposed to be spotless to be done eating. She was like 3 or so, and I was maybe 8. Really? This other time I went to the zoo, and he was there. I had gotten my face painted to look like a cat, you know, whiskers and whatnot. In front of my dad and his parents he said that I sorta look like a pig twice in a row. Really? Yeah, he was a nasty kid, but there was this one day in particular that I always remember. Being I'm mischievous, we'd sometimes get goofy and make crude jokes. Yeah, he was kind of a bully to me, but I was dumb and tried getting along with most people. One time we made jokes about fachting, and if we lit a match under us, we'd launch out of our seats like a rocket during lunch, and we got caught at least once or twice and got timeouts for it. Anyway, this one day in particular, we're in class, 2nd grade. The teacher was giving a lecture to the class or something like that. She'd walk around and call on students to read something from the book we had. We got bored and decided to whisper to each other whatever the topic was. It somehow turned into pop and pee jokes, and he started pretending to be pooping and peeing using his pencil. So he gets to a point where he had his legs spread, and he had the pencil under his crotch, and he was pulling it out slowly saying pop pop pop. Little did we know the teacher stopped talking. It was silent except for him saying pop. Her and the whole class were just staring at him. She was an old, uptight, strict teacher. Thought shut up was a swear, ECT, and just oh my god, you should have seen the look on her face. He says, what? And she tells him to go to the office. I didn't find it funny at the time, but I've got tears writing this. I don't even care if that was justice or not, but that was funny as hell.